Hello and welcome. My name is Jisha Menon, and I'm the Sakurako and William Fisher Family Director of Stanford Global Studies. At the outset, let me thank my terrific team at Global Studies, Kate Kuhns, Kristen Hara, Julie Tatsukawa, Stephanie Pitkiewicz, Donna Evan-Kesef, and Franco Erico. Thanks for helping put together this webinar. Global Dialogues is a program intended to foster fresh thinking on critical global issues and develop new approaches to grapple with the complexities of our interconnected and constantly changing world. Today's webinar focuses on global debt and its discontents. Across the world today, nations are sinking under the weight of unsustainable debt. In 2024, developing countries' public debt was $31 trillion. Today, 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on either health or education. Developing countries' net interest payments on public debt in 2024 was $921 billion. Governments are spending more money to creditors than they can spend on schools, hospitals, or protecting their people from climate disasters. The cost is staggering. Billions live with fewer doctors, fewer teachers, and fragile safety nets. Add to this, trade wars and geopolitical conflicts are cutting off export revenues, driving up costs of imports, and pushing borrowing costs ever higher. The scholars we've gathered today have been clear. To break this pattern, we need nothing less than a reimagining of the global financial system. Today's conversation is one step toward that vision, toward understanding debt distress and imagining a more just and sustainable financial order. So joining us today are Hannah Appel, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Associate Director, UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. Hannah is an economic anthropologist interested in transnational capitalism and finance, debt and debtors' unions, the African continent's place in global capitalism, the economic imagination, anti-capitalist and abolitionist social movements. Jayati Ghosh is professor of economics at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Jayati Ghosh is an award-winning scholar who taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for 35 years. She has authored and edited over 21 books and 230 scholarly articles. Among her numerous awards is the International Economics Association Fellow Award for 2023 for, and I quote, outstanding work and excellence in economic research, research-driven popular writing, and economic policy making, close quotes. And she has advised governments in India, South Africa, and other countries, and consulted for various international organizations. Fabio Vighi is professor of critical theory and Italian at Cardiff University, UK. His research focuses on continental philosophy, the political economy, ideology critique, theoretical psychoanalysis, and cinema. His recent work includes emergency capitalism, unworkable capitalism and the new political unconscious, critical theory and film, among others. These are, of course, very abbreviated introductions, so please find their longer bios in the link posted in the chat feature. And we'll begin taking questions from the audience in about 30 minutes or so into the program. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. So thank you all for joining us today. And I thought what we would do is kick off with a question that maybe we can each sort of think about in greater depth. And that is, what makes the today's global debt landscape different than what we've seen in the past? Is there anything qualitatively new or different about this particular moment? Jayati, would you like to go first?
Thanks very much, Jisha, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you, even online, in this discussion. Yes, what you're asking is actually very relevant because this is qualitatively new. And people are going to say, well, we've seen debt crises before, perhaps not the younger people in this group, but certainly many of us have experienced or seen debt crises occur, especially among the developing countries, every 20 or 30 years or so. There are these cycles of debt, for sure. What's different about this particular debt crisis is the sheer complexity of it all, which is to say that it's no longer a fairly straightforward creditor landscape. The previous debt crises that we've seen, at least in the last 70 years, have been dominantly driven or involving public creditors, whether they are national governments, donor governments as they tend to be called, or multilateral financing agencies like the World Bank, the IMF, the development banks, and so on. This is a much more complex landscape because we now have the majority of third world debt being held by private creditors, and especially through the bond markets, which is again relatively new for many of these countries. Many of these countries were actually more or less excluded from bond markets. They didn't, their sovereign bonds were not available for international purchase, or even if they were, then very few international purchasers were available. So this is relatively new. We've seen this over the past decade and a half, maybe the last 15 years, particularly after the global financial crisis. And so what really happened after that was, as some of you may remember, that there was a massive increase in credit provided to and by the major commercial banks as part of a bailout operation of the big countries' central banks. So in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and so on, you had significant increases in the liquidity that banks held. And they were then anxious to find new avenues, places where they could park their money because they were getting very cheap money. They had a significant increase, basically helping them recover from the irresponsibility that got them into the financial crisis in the first place. But they were then able to put money, relatively small proportions of their portfolio, but they were able to put this money into a range of countries which earlier would not have been able to access private credit. And so you find that the major bond market, bondholders, for example, there was a phenomenon which is now known as the emerging markets. Now, emerging markets, what exactly is an emerging market? It's a developing country that was integrated with global capital markets and was seen as creditworthy. And that's a big change, right? Many of these countries were not seen as creditworthy earlier. Then you had frontier markets. Now, frontier markets are the ones that were literally beyond the pale. They were not even considered eligible for any kind of credit from private sources. And so you have countries in Africa, in Asia, low-income countries with relatively less developed internal financial markets able to access credit and to put their sovereign bonds into the global market. So all of this was actively encouraged by the IMF, by Davos, the World Economic Forum, and others basically saying, oh, look, interest rates are so low, there's all this money available. Countries should take advantage of this. This is a great opportunity for them to access capital. The problem with that, of course, is that, they're still at the bottom of that global pecking order in the ladder of the currency hierarchy. So when there's the first sign of any trouble, that's when the capital leaves you first. That's when, the credit becomes tighter, less people are willing to buy your bonds, and so the yields on the bonds go up. And this started happening from the pandemic onwards. The COVID-19 pandemic was the first big shock, which reduced, of course, the foreign exchange earnings of many of these countries. But it also then caused capital to be much more careful and reticent about where it actually put money. So there was a significant volatility and then a reduction in the flows that came to these countries. And then you had the Ukraine war and the associated rise in food and fuel prices, which was a lot driven by financial speculation, actually. And then you got the rich countries' central banks responding by raising interest rates and tightening monetary policy, all of which meant capital comes flowing back to these rich countries, and the markets for these emerging and frontier markets tightens hugely. So they're suddenly facing falling access to credit, rising costs of credit, demands for repayment, which are harder for them to meet because their export revenues, their tourism revenues, their remittance revenues have all come down. So it's like a multiple whammy. They're getting it from all directions. We've had a range of near defaults And we've had a few actual defaults, about 13 in the period since then. But it's not just the defaults, it's exactly what Jisha was saying. It is the fact that countries are now spending much more on just repaying the debt than on the basic needs of their citizens, the health, education, food, essential rights of the citizens. And that's a deep crisis, but it's not recognized as such because it's not threatening the financial system. And so the final point I want to make is that, it is a deep crisis. But why don't you see it in the papers? Why aren't policymakers responding in the rich countries? Why isn't anybody really doing something about it? Because they don't see it as something that is risking the broader financial structures that have been created. So when they think something does do that, whether it's, the possible failure of Silicon Valley Bank or Syndicate Bank in the US, or the actual failure of Credit Suisse in Switzerland, then you see they act very quickly. They are immediate. They're on the job. They work over weekends. Within 5 days, they've sorted the problem out. They've done an enormous bailout. They provided masses of money. They've broken their own rules to make sure the system is stable. When it's just a question of lives in poor countries where people are dying anyway and governments are struggling but they're repaying, then it's not seen as a threat. Then finance is not concerned, and that means policymakers in rich countries are not really that concerned. So even when they make noises about the debt crisis, they don't really take it that seriously. I think that's the other sense in which this is different.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's a very layered and thoughtful response. Hannah, what would you say as a response to that?
Yeah, of course. First, thank you so much for having me. And Jayati, what a privilege to go after you. And I hope this will usefully pick up on many of the themes that you raised. So when we talk about kind of global debt crises and a global debt landscape, I think it's important to name the categories and scales of debt that we're talking about. So for most of us, we are often talking kind of de facto about sovereign debt, right? Debt that is held by federal governments and owed in various ways, whether it's on the private markets or kind of public or international financial institution markets. I think later in the conversation, and I actually think Jayati just brought it up, we should also talk about municipal debt and household debt, right? Because when the price of food goes up, when healthcare is privatized, when school fees go up, families, right? The Ni Una Menos collective, who I'll probably talk about a little later, describes these problems as sovereign debt imploding into the household. So I think we want to think of those scales at the same time. But if I'm going to start with sovereign debt, which I think is the kind of frame of the question, I want to ask what seems like a little bit of a lateral question, but I think it's related, which is what kind of a problem is the US dollar and for whom? So one of the things that to me is new in today's debt landscape, I agree with everything Jayati said, mine is somewhat, it's related, but lateral, is actually the transnational awareness, both in political landscapes and scholarly landscapes, of the problem of the US dollar and how US monetary hegemony, right? Everybody has to pay their debts in dollars, regardless of the currency that they use, allows the United States to flex imperial power. This is that currency hierarchy that Jayati referred to. Now, Trump's recent attacks on the Federal Reserve and the kind of sacredness of the US Treasury bill is a very interesting recent wrinkle that I won't address directly, though I bet we'll talk about it in Q&A. But so to illustrate this shift that to me feels new, this kind of awareness, I'm going to quote President Lula from Brazil in 2023. It's a speech he gave at the BRICS Development Bank in which he stated, quote, I'm quoting him, "Every night I ask myself, why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar? Why can't we do trade based on our own currencies? Who was it that decided that the dollar was the currency after the disappearance of the gold standard? In the 21st century, we can try something different." End quote. Okay, so Lula is addressing the problem of the US dollar. I'm addressing the problem of the US dollar. What do I mean? That's a layered question. I'm going to illustrate via a recent example coinciding with the newness that Jayati referred to. And that's the question of how and why sovereign debt burdens on the African continent in particular rose over the last 5 years. Jayati gave one explanation. This is kind of the same explanation, but from a different angle. So March 2022 to May 2023, Jayati said this, the US Federal Reserve, picture the map of the United States, our Federal Reserve increased the interest rate 10 times, right? Over that, what would that be, a 14-month period. They were responding, in theory, to moderate inflation within our borders, right? And this is conventional economic wisdom, that this would shrink the amount of money in circulation, it would drive down demand, so it would lower prices and bring that moderate inflation inside US borders under control. But if you look at that 14 months of Federal Reserve interest rate rises from the global South and from countries on the African continent in particular, Milton Friedman's very famous dictum that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, right? Too much money chasing too few goods, is simply wrong. So this is kind of the methodological nationalism of economics that's not just a problem in our disciplines, but needless to say, a problem in global governance, right? So as those interest rate hikes unfold in the United States, notice my scare quotes, countries with less monetary power, right? Countries down that currency hierarchy that Jayati is talking about, far beyond the United States, experience direct effects. By the end of 2022 and early 2023, right, those incremental Federal Reserve interest rate rises, 35 of Africa's 42 currencies had suffered depreciation as a function of what was happening in Washington, D.C. It had nothing to do with their own monetary policy. Any country holding dollar-denominated debt, which, of course, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, as Jayati explained, was essentially all the countries on the African continent, those debt balances are rising so steeply. Why? Only because the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. Their rising debt balances have nothing to do with the underlying fundamentals of their own economies or their own economic sovereignty, which is what I'm pointing out they don't have, right? And everything to do, or quite a bit to do, with monetary policy in the US and nominally for the US. So you look at the Ghanaian cedi, you look at the Zambian kwacha, you look at the Ugandan shilling, they all depreciated dramatically in relation to the dollar during this time. The Egyptian pound lost 50% of its value against the US dollar. They had a $3 billion loan facility that was extended by the IMF in 2022, and it dramatically compromised their ability to pay. And one of the things that when we talk about the political economy of debt and the power of the dollar in particular is that we also have to talk about its kind of geopolitical power. So I just mentioned what happened in Egypt. So October 2023, a document leaked out from the Israeli defense minister amidst the devastation that was unfolding at the time in Gaza. And it was a proposal from Israel to Egypt that they open the crossing and relocate Palestinians in the Sinai, right, in Egypt. Why on earth would Egypt accept that solution when most of its population historically has been pro-Palestinian? Because what Israel was offering was to pay off Egypt's dollar-denominated debts, right? So this is kind of extraordinary US originated exploding sovereign debt burdens becoming a geopolitical tool that we know that Egypt said no, right, in the negotiations that how Israel is trying to flex its power. So the power of the US dollar is in fact not new. I don't want to suggest that somehow the power I'm describing is new. Debt as a geopolitical cudgel, needless to say, is not new. But I would argue that the awareness of the US dollar is new. Again, both kind of on the political terrain in the way that Lula articulated it, but also it's coming up in scholarship. Jayati used the phrase currency hierarchy. I'm talking about monetary sovereignty or the imperial power of the US dollar. There's so much more critical scholarship on the specific role of the US and not just sovereign debt, right? So this punchline, and I'll stop here, is that US Federal Reserve policy, which is nominally national in intention and scope, is in fact, has been the de facto monetary policy of much of the rest of the world without any of their input or their priorities in mind. And in this moment, when we see US imperialism faltering for kind of interesting and perhaps unexpected reasons, I would argue that we're in a potential moment of rupture for US dollar hegemony. I'm not saying that's necessarily good or bad. It's not clear at all what direction that will go in, but we are in a potential moment of rupturing of that US dollar imperial order.
Great. Fabio, what would you like to add to this conversation?
Okay, very rich conversation already. So thank you, first of all, Jisha, for inviting me, and it's really an honor for me to be here today. I obviously endorse what has been said so far by Anna and Jayati. One thing I wanted to add is that I obviously look at this debt question maybe from a slightly more, I would say, macro level, right? Almost like systemic stroke philosophical level, right? I really think that when we talk about debt today, we need to keep in mind that we live in debt-based or credit-addicted societies, including in affluent societies, right? And I think that then also determines the policies that have been described so far by Hannah and by Jayati. Debt is absolutely ontological now in philosophical terms. It's central to social reproduction. This is now abundantly clear, I think, that we are, as Western societies, also completely dependent on the continuous issuance of new credit. That has become the systemic driver for societal reproduction, right? I mean, let's not forget the US has a national debt of almost $37 trillion, right? And that needs to be refinanced. About 8 to 10 of that amount of number of trillions need to be refinanced within the next fiscal year. And in that sense, debt becomes also, I think, a geopolitical weapon. Because obviously refinancing that debt implies making sure that the cost of that refinancing stays low, and it implies also retaining the imperial dominance that has been referred to earlier, right? Making sure that the dollar remains, despite all the tensions and conflicts that there are now, the global reserve currencies. If we look at other Western countries, European countries, etc., we know that the kind of Maginot line of 100% ratio between GDP and debt has been passed by most of them, right? We're thinking about the UK, France, obviously Italy, not to mention Japan, of course. So all these countries are kind of hostage to their ability to draw capital for the reproduction of their society. To me, this is what I call senile capitalism. It's capitalism getting to the very end of the road, no longer being able to reproduce itself through its own immanent internal laws of wealth production, and having to have recourse to external injections of credit. And there's no end in sight to this logic, right? We really are caught in a kind of catch-22 situation where that toxic dependency is something that cannot be shaken off at all. And that, I think, has massive geopolitical repercussions. We know that every crisis is a good opportunity to print more money, or rather to mouse click money on computer screens, and then, of course, throw it into especially the financial system, which is clearly leveraged. We know that it's debt leverage, so it's absolutely central. Debt is central to markets like the repo market, for example, where capital is raised. So the whole system in its entirety is debt-based and credit-addicted. And I think we shouldn't forget that question, because it really poses existential questions about the capacity of capitalism as a mode of production to continue sort of reproducing itself today. I think we've really come to the end of the line, and I'm interested in two questions, just very briefly before I stop. One is how we got to this historically, right? How this trajectory, we got to this trajectory, what made it possible systemically, according to these sort of objective laws of capitalism. And I tend to look at, a kind of internal reason that explains this addiction to debt and to credit, essentially, which maybe we can discuss a little later. But I think there's a clear trajectory that has led to where we are. And also, obviously, the way in which this absolute dependency on debt sort of intersects with geopolitical crisis, emergencies of all kind. I've just written a book on emergency capitalism, which kind of shows, or kind of sort of is driven by this idea that this credit addiction is now deeply connected with international conflicts and crises. Let's not forget that wars have always been one of the favorite means to raise to get credit into circulation. So it's a very delicate, I would say, kind of dramatic point that we live in at the moment, and it's very difficult to see a solution. Very difficult to see a way out of this sort of debt-based system as it is now.
Great, thank you. I want to return to Jayati Ghosh and just, sort of because you've done so much incredible thinking and writing about these issues, and I know your work with the Jubilee report has been quite extraordinary. So I would love to take a moment to just hear you talk a little bit more about the Jubilee report, blueprint for tackling the debt and development crises and creating the financial foundations for a sustainable, people-centered global economy. This was commissioned by Pope Francis, and the report tasked you, Joseph Stiglitz, and other colleagues to explore the flaws in the global financial architecture. So can you tell us a little bit more about this report and its recommendations?
Sure, Jisha, I would love to. But I'm also very tempted to respond to some of the
Sure.
excellent interventions by Fabio and Hannah. So very quickly, would you mind if I extended my
Please
time?
go ahead.
I'm going to
Yeah,
begin by responding to you, but I do want to pick up some of
let's
the
do that.
really very important points made by Hannah and Fabio. So yes, the Jubilee report was commissioned by Pope Francis. This is actually a Jubilee year in the Catholic tradition, every 25 years. And if you remember, in 2000, there was actually an effective debt jubilee, the highly indebted poor countries initiative, which really was possible because it was mainly public debt that is publicly held debt, government held debt, that was to some extent reduced. But the current landscape, as I said, is very different. And this report recognizes that. It has a fairly extensive discussion of the complexity of the debt landscape, but also recognizes that it doesn't mean that nothing can be done. In fact, there is a lot that can be done. And there are specific recommendations, not just for dealing with debt, the fact that you have to enforce much greater rapidity in the solutions and not wait for a systemic breakdown, the way that I suggested, that they're only bothered if it threatens the entire system. And ways in which we could ensure that. For example, that if a country or group of countries declares themselves to be in debt difficulty, that just like you do in all capitalist systems within countries, you really do have a debt workout mechanism. Yeah, a company or a person can go and declare themselves unable to pay, and there is a process. And it's a time-bound process in which the creditors have to hold on. There's a moratorium on on the payment of interest in that period. And there is a process of working it out. And then there is a process whereby creditors would get only a reduced share of the debt that they hold, depending on the nature of the workout that's agreed. That's the kind of thing that can be done for developing countries, or for any country that is a sovereign debtor, in fact, as long as there's some kind of a global agreement. Now, the difficulty here is that, again, there are all these private debtors, creditors, and they have no interest in doing this. But most of this, 95% of the debt, is held according to the laws of just two places, New York State and the City of London, that is UK. So if we can actually get some kind of a minimal law passed in both of these legislatures, effectively saying that creditors must be willing to undergo debt workouts just as they have to do for domestic debtors. You're not asking for any special treatment for sovereigns. You're simply saying the same kinds of rules should apply. That would already have a huge benefit. And there are various mechanisms we proposed. But one of the most obvious things is that if you do declare bankruptcy or difficulty in repayment or whatever, then there is an automatic standstill. A standstill on debt means that it's frozen in time. So the amount of interest you owe right now, the total principal you owe right now, is stuck in time. It doesn't keep expanding when you're not repaying. A moratorium means that you're just kicking the can down the road. So you don't have to pay for the next 6 months or a year or 2 years, but at the end of that period, bam, a bigger amount comes to hit you. So a standstill is really good because it concentrates the minds of the creditors. That way they want to get a quick resolution. Now they don't care because they're going to keep getting paid at the end of it anyway. That's number one. There are a bunch of other things we recommended for debt workout, but we also said, look, part of the flaw is the global financial system, exactly in the way that Hannah and Fabio have outlined already. And so you really have to address those. Yes, they are reflective of major power imbalances, some of which are frankly outdated. But now the institutional structures are also deeply unbalanced in terms of power, and they all operate against the interests of the debtor countries in lower income countries. So what we have suggested is a range of reforms also to the international financial architecture, including to the big institutions, the IMF and so on, but also to enable access to liquidity at least slightly more democratically than there is at the moment. So the IMF has something called special drawing rights. It's a kind of liquidity that they can create. And you can just create it. It's like central banks can just so-called print money, expand money supply. Similarly, the IMF can just create it. And in fact, it then just lies in the accounts of every member. And it's only when that member chooses to shift that into some other currency that they can use, dollar, yen, euro, renminbi, whatever, it's only then that they have to pay a relatively small interest rate. And they don't have to repay the principal at any point. So it's actually a very effective way of providing necessary resources and even serving as a global financial safety net. So we have argued that there should be an automatic increase in SDRs every year in line with the increase in global GDP, because that's what you're supposed to do with reserves. They should be going up the same as the GDP goes up. So increase automatically the SDRs and allocate them to countries, but don't allocate them just according to the quotas in the IMF, because that's stupid. That gives money to countries that don't need it. The US and Western Europe and Japan, I will get 70% of that money, which is crazy, right? They don't need it. They have already global reserve currencies. Give it to countries that are experiencing difficulties that are not of their own making. The kind of situation that Hannah talked about, the spillover effects of US monetary policy. So if you have a terms of trade shock, if you have an interest rate shock, if you have a climate shock, which is again not of your own making, all of these shocks would enable you to access money from SDR money. And that would completely alter a lot of the huge difficulties that many countries are facing. So when the US raised interest rates, as Hannah mentioned, 10 times over 11 months or whatever, that's a period of an interest rate shock. All these countries should have automatically got SDRs, which would have at least eased the huge difficulties that they have been facing since then. The other issue is about the interest rates that they have to pay, because they're seen as, at the bottom, supposedly because they're more risky, again, inverted air commas. They are not more risky. If an investor had put money in a country that had defaulted on its loan in Africa, and there are 4 countries like that defaulted, or they had put their money in US Treasury bills, they would have got 5 times the return on the supposedly defaulting country than they got from the US Treasury bill, because of this massive hike, this massive spread, supposedly the risk spread that these countries have to pay, which is frankly obscene. So we suggest limits, caps on debt repayment. The British colonial government in India had a very neat cap. They said, look, if you have repaid the principal and that same amount again as interest, that's it. You don't have to pay anymore. Sounds reasonable, right? Why should you pay more than twice the amount you originally borrowed? Yet many countries are paying that now because they have such high spreads, 10%, 11% over the US Fed rate. And that means and if you can't pay it, then that adds to your principal, and then you're paying compound interest on that. It's ridiculous. So they end up paying 3-4 times the amount they originally borrowed. And they're still in debt after all that. Okay, so many proposals that we think are very, very feasible and doable, but the geopolitics is not there to deliver it. Having said that, I think I just want to pick up 2 of the fascinating points that Fabio and Hannah made. One, Fabio's question about how do we get here to this point. And, this relates also to Hannah's other broader point that we have to look at debt not just in terms of sovereign debt of poor countries, but how we are all more and more just indebted societies. And that's really what, when many people talk about financialization, that's what they're referring to, right? Now, why this financialization? And I would argue that, in fact, financialization is a response of global capitalism to this inherent tendency to stagnation. And in a way, it also reflects the shift in global bargaining power that globalization, as we think of it today, is also part of, which is the much greater power of capital relative to labor, which has been shown across countries in declining wage shares of national income, and within capital, a massive increase in concentration even of profits and interest and rent, so that the top companies get 90% of that surplus. And the rest of the, so it's not just between capital and labor, but even within capital, small and medium enterprises are losing out. Large capital is gaining. Within large capital, multinational capitals are gaining. Within multinationals, US multinationals are gaining more and more. So there's this massive concentration at the top. But this fine, and what does that do? It reduces the purchasing power of ordinary people, right? So markets don't grow at the same rate. Now, how, if you're not letting wages increase, and how do you get markets to grow? You basically make workers borrow rather than get higher wages. And that's the financialization. And then you increasingly make more and more basic and essential services things that you have to pay for, which means you borrow to get health, you borrow to get education for your child, you borrow to get a house. And all of that means that then there's another layer of intermediation. So the debt-driven capitalism that we have today, that Fabio expressed so well, is a way to generate profits out of increasingly a much more stagnant kind of global economy. And yes, I completely agree with him that that has its limits. But, you know, there's a rather depressing phrase that the German philosopher Wolfgang Streeck had, which, not phrase, it's an idea, which unfortunately stays with me. Wolfgang Streeck said that, listen, capitalism is actually already dead. It's just that there's nobody to move the dead body out of the way. So this big dead body is hanging over all of us. And so we're stuck with this capitalism, which is actually not delivering in terms of dynamism. So somehow we have to move that dead body before we can breathe and get going again. And that brings me to the other very fascinating point that Hannah mentioned about, you know, that this could be a potential moment of rupture of the US imperial order. And again, I think there is, you know, really there's a lot to unpack in there. And one angle I just want to highlight, you know, we all think of Trump as the big disruptor. And of course he is. I mean, you know, there's no question. But he's the disruptor of trade globalization. Okay, he's very deeply into financial globalization. And, you know, his interests are those of big finance. I mean, his Treasury Secretary is quite open about it. And of course, the AI, the big tech bros and all of that. But the moment of financial deglobalization, I believe, was begun under the Biden regime. And it was begun with the sanctions on Russia. Because the US has been doing this in the past, right? They bring sanctions on Venezuela, on Iran, on Cuba, which have led to many deaths and, you know, a lot of damage for people in those societies. But you do it to Russia and people say, oh, wait a minute, that's big. If you can do it to Russia, tomorrow you might do it to me. And so we have seen since then, since 2022, we have seen a movement out of US dollar reserves, US Treasury bills. We have seen more and more, not just purchases of gold, but all kinds of other transactions. You know, there's a lot of talk about the BRICS developing their own currency. I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow, but I don't think that matters. What really matters is that the BRICS Plus and a bunch of other countries are developing alternative arrangements for trading. So trade finance, now they are doing for the normal exchange. So, you know, SWIFT, less and less countries are opting for more SWIFT transactions. BRICS Clear is already up and it's not running, but it's certainly walking. And there are many more attempts to actually think of alternatives, Plan B. And that already started. What Trump is doing is accelerating that process of Plan B.
Great. Thank you so much. Fabio, I see your hand up. Did you want to respond to something that was said or offer some more thoughts?
Yes, I mean, so many interesting, again, inputs there. And they really kind of overlap with my view of capitalism as a dead body, and we don't know what to do with it now. We still have it upon us, but we know that it's no longer working in terms of producing the wealth that it needs to reproduce the society. For me, that's the key historical point. There was a point in history in the 1970s where the use of technology essentially eliminated more labor force than capital was able to reabsorb. And therefore, societies could not create enough economic value from labor, from the exploitation of labor, to reproduce those societies. Hence, the drive to financialization, which is what really defines neoliberalism in the 80s and earlier. And obviously that credit addiction that I was talking about, because obviously the drive to financialization is deeply addicted to credit creation. And that's where credit goes. Most of the credit goes to them, right? It doesn't trickle down. There's only the crumbs trickle down. Most of the credit that is created goes into there. So we have a problem also with fiat currencies from that point onwards, because they are devalued. They begin to devalue massively. So the problem of capitalism as a dead body manifests itself on a very empirical, phenomenological level in the crisis of money. Money itself, insofar as it's no longer backed by gold, but it's simply fiat money backed by government, by governments alone, continues to lose value. And this is a phenomenon, again, that is really very broad and very global, very global. And I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing today is also how to try and come out and find a solution to that problem. When we talk about the possibility of a kind of gold-backed currency, I don't know how realistic really it is, but we know that the central banks around the world are stacking more and more gold, because that probably is seen as a safer asset to link their currencies to than anything else at the moment, particularly in connection with the devaluation of the dollar that seems to have no end in sight. Again, the more you print, the more you as long as that printed cash stays somehow trapped in the financial sector, then you can contain inflation more or less, so devaluation. But just imagine if that cash that is trapped in the financial sector was to be deployed as real demand in the real economy. All of a sudden, we would get to hyperinflation straight away in no time. Weimar would be nothing compared to what we get today, because of the amount of cash that has been printed over the last 20, 25 years, and obviously used for financial transactions in kind of the speculative sector. So I really insist that we have a massive systemic problem that requires really deep thinking about those solutions on that level. And I fully appreciate all the rest that has been said so far about solving the empirical issues, the kind of imperialistic issues that we still have today. This is obviously also perhaps even more important at a certain level, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of what goes on under our backs all the time, which is this implosion, gradual implosion of what we used to call capitalism. Maybe we should call it in a different way now. I know that somebody like Varoufakis calls it techno-feudalism now, right? So maybe it's already a kind of techno-feudalism. We just don't realize that it is, but it's already a kind of techno-feudalism. So right. I'll stop there.
Well, I just wonder if we could return to Hannah, because I know that one of the problems maybe with talking about the narrative of debt as starting in the 70s is that older histories get eclipsed, and we are no longer talking about the kind of long history of colonial extraction and how that shapes contemporary relationships between global North and global South, and also what the racial dimensions of debt might be. So I wonder, Hannah, if you could, given your research, could address that question more centrally.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that in just 1 minute. Like my fellow panelists, I just want to say a few fast things before I give that 1 semester course of International Development Studies 1 in 5 minutes, but I will do that in just a second. I just wanted to say, I think this idea of kind of legislating the haircut in private credit markets is so fun. But then also, I just wanted to say back to Jayati in particular, but also to the audience. So I was talking about the problem of the US dollar. And when folks think about how to address the problem of the US dollar, there's, exactly as Jayati said, there is a kind of broad bouquet of de-dollarization processes afoot at different levels that long precede Trump. I didn't mean to suggest, I completely agree. They were really kind of a fuel was lit under them, if you will, for a loaded metaphor by the Russia-Ukraine war. So like Nostro and Vostro accounts, obviously bilateral deals with oil so that oil can actually disintermediate the US dollar, which is one of the ways that, the US dollar has been kept so strong is because it's the global markets and oil are denominated in dollars. But SDRs, special drawing rights in particular, right? If we can think of utopian de-dollarization scenarios, and we can think of very severely dystopian de-dollarization scenarios, and we can think of a lot of things in between. And I think thinking, creatively and expansively about, special drawing rights, especially when the allocative power behind them, who has the power to decide to whom and when and under what circumstances and at what interest rate SDRs are allocated, I think that's really exciting. So I just wanted to name that. Also, as a student debtor, I'm very familiar with compounding interest. We have paid off our premium and still owe more than the premium today. And that's gonna, I mean, we're never gonna pay it off. And you, of course, we're talking about it in the case of developing countries. And finally, this question, who will move the dead body out of the way? For the audience, some of our questions at the end get right to that, right? To the question of, from my perspective and my research, social movements and debtors unions in particular. So I'm excited to get there. Oh my gosh, but now IDS 1, International Development Studies 1, in a very quick time frame. Okay, so the question again, how do historical forms of colonial extraction, which is also importantly, historically, the moment of racialization in the way that we understand it now, right? There was already intra-European racialization. So the etymological root of the word slave actually comes from Slavic folks because Slavs were enslaved in the households of wealthier Spanish and Italians, right? But then, of course, slave now invokes the African diaspora. So intra-European forms of racialization that precede the colonialism that I'm about to talk about then get exported and are remade as European folks encounter indigenous folks in the Americas, Black folks in Africa, et cetera. So that is a kind of underlying history of, this is going to go a teeny bit long, but I promise I will go fast. So I'm just going to talk about 3 very quick periods, right? The question is colonialism, extraction, and debt today. So I think we need to talk very quickly about colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. We need to talk about an interceding period that was unfortunately brief around anti-colonial independence struggles and a moment that was known as developmentalism, right? Very specific kind of Raoul Prebisch-oriented projects. And then, of course, structural adjustment as neocolonialism, as Thomas Sankara famously put it. And for those who don't know, structural adjustment is a kind of debt. Let's just call it debt, right? The kinds of debts that we're talking about today. Okay, so if you remember any one thing from this crazy overview, remember this. Global wealth and global poverty, as we know them today, were created in relation to one another, right? There are not internal explanations, by which I mean within certain nation state boundaries, of why certain places are wealthy and certain places are poor. And the easiest way to name those historical transnational relationships that endured for centuries, that is important to remember too, of wealth extraction on the one hand, right? The extraction of land, the extraction of labor, the extraction of natural resources. That's the creation of poverty for some, and that is wealth creation for others. The easiest way to name that is colonialism. So kind of radical oversimplification, but let's just call it that. So let's start. I'm not going to go century by century, but because I like to give specific examples, the 1500s, right? Hernán Cortés, Pizarro, going to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, going to the Inca capital of Peru. Hopefully most of you, you're like, these are extraordinarily wealthy places, right? And they were extraordinarily wealthy kingdoms. By 1600, Europeans find themselves in the silver mines of Bolivia and Potosí. In each of those places, right, Europeans are enslaving indigenous people to work as mine labor, in part using the racialized justifications, right, that these people are inferior, they're not civilized, they don't know God, they don't know Christ, and therefore we should civilize them. They're also demanding tribute in gold and silver and maiming or killing if people do not respond to that. So a couple hundred years later, by the early 1800s, 100 million kilograms of silver have been drained from Latin America and have been pumped into the European economy. Poverty for some, wealth creation for others, right? And Latin America is not only losing gold and silver, they are horrifically losing people. So by the middle of the 1600s, 150 years after European incursion, a staggering, horrifying, it chokes me up every time I say it, 95% of the pre-Columbian population had been killed. 95%, right? Okay, so what are European countries doing with all that gold and silver? They're buying cotton, they're buying tea, they're buying indigo, they're buying fine porcelain, they're buying silk from China and India, right? China and India leading up to that moment had controlled about 65% of the global economy. The European countries, via the gold and silver of Latin America, are trying to catch up. They are taking those manufactured goods from China and India to the Atlantic coast of Africa, where they are trading them, now you can see I'm jumping through history, for enslaved people, who they then bring back to the Americas, where, remember, those indigenous people are no longer there and the land is no longer theirs, to develop plantation agriculture in places that are increasingly settled by people, European people, people of European descent, and cleared of indigenous populations. Marx has an extraordinarily famous phrase about this moment that I think everybody should know if you don't know it. He says, I'm quoting him here, it's from Capital, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production." That's where Marx is first laying out his, what he called primitive accumulation, what is often kind of re-theorized as accumulation by dispossession, right? If you've heard that, that's what it means, right? That some are accumulating by dispossessing others. So often the origins of wealth in our kind of contemporary world are narrated in the Industrial Revolution in Britain. But of course, the Industrial Revolution, if you think of the history that I'm talking about, was not in Britain, right? Wealth and poverty are created in relationship to one another. So obviously I'm riffing on Eric Williams' great thesis on capitalism and slavery, Cotton Kingdom. Sven Becker has written about this more recently, very much more forcefully bringing in India and China. But during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, think about Jamaica, think about Trinidad and Tobago, think about Barbados, think about Ghana, think about Nigeria, think about the US, which was a colony at the time, right? The British, in order to industrialize, are growing crops on land that was not theirs, right? It is their colonial possession, with labor they did not have to pay. And those are captive markets for their goods as they are industrializing, right? Jamaica, take all of our goods and you are forbidden from industrializing and producing your own goods. So it is really those transnational relationships that enable what is called a British pivot, right, to industrialization. Okay. Developmentalism. People, rightly, the people who move, what is it? We move the dead body of colonialism out of the way, are like, hell no. Eric Williams among them, right? Who famously participates. He gets his PhD in Britain, and he famously goes back to Trinidad and Tobago after having written Capitalism and Slavery and becomes their first post-independence prime minister, right? Anti-colonial uprising, decolonization across the global South. But what do you get? Do you suddenly get a national economy because you're sovereign? Of course you don't, right? You are still absolutely enmeshed in those colonial relationships. So this is Raoul Prebisch, of course, underdevelopment and global inequality were the result of the way colonialism had organized the world system. And then how do those newly independent nations decide, right? What are they going to do? This is what Prebisch defined as developmentalism. And many of the kind of most famous leaders of this moment, whether it's in South Asia or Africa, East Asia, right, are taking on these policies. Protect their own, subsidize their own industries to grow their national economies, protect their infant industries, put high tariffs on imported goods. I'm in Jamaica, I say, Europe, stop, England, stop importing me all these things. We are no longer a captive market for you. If you want to import, I'm going to put really high taxes on it. Restrictions on foreign capital flow and ownership of national assets, including land, and land reform. Why land reform? To give one famous example, in the 1930s, the United Fruit Company, which is a United States company, owned 3.5 million acres of land in Central America and the Caribbean. The United Fruit Company in 1930s was the largest landowner in Guatemala. That is why land reform, because without taking away those industries and that land and all of that wealth that the colonizer had amassed over time, you are never going to be able to find yourself in an economy where you can participate, let alone compete in the kind of global economy that was developing at that time. Needless to say, these developmental policies were very unpopular. So you see an era of coups, you see an era of the CIA trying to overthrow a whole bunch of people, right? Allende is a very famous example of this, Chile, etc. They're trying to take away the land from the United Fruit Company, right? So from the 1950s to the 1970s, mostly through coups, the West is kind of trying to struggle to defeat the rise of developmentalism, and they couldn't. But what happened is they did end up using debt to defeat it. So this is the kind of seed of the history that I want to plant, right? Colonialism brings us up to this moment. Developmentalism surges, internally radically varied. So 67, what's the precise moment? 1967, Israel attacks Egypt, launches the Six-Day War, incidentally, when Israel annexed Gaza, right? A coalition of Arab states retaliates. And part of what they do is they use OPEC to say, we're going to drive the global price of oil up to 70% to try to get the US backing off from supporting Israel. In 1974, right, in the heat of this developmental moment, the global price of oil, denominated in dollars, remember that, rose from $3 a barrel to almost 12. Saudi Arabia, OPEC countries are flush with cash, and this goes back to what Jayati said in this current debt moment, right? They deposit it in US banks, and US banks are like, we have a ton of money. What are we going to do with all of this money? Well, guess what? At the same time, those global South countries who are running those developmentalist programs, which are deeply fossil fuel based, can't afford oil and gas anymore, right? So they're ready to take out loans to fund all of those industries that they're trying to grow, to fund the energy needs of those industries. They take out huge loans, then there's an interest rate shock, not surprising. And the IMF and the World Bank step in as kind of global debt enforcers. And guess what they say? They say, we will refinance your debt if, and now I'm glossing, but basically if you undo your developmentalist programs, get rid of the land reform, privatize everything you have sought to make public, fire all your public sector workers who are running your schools and running your hospitals, let a kind of international NGO sector step in, right? Not accidental throughout the 80s and 90s that you see NGOs, for example, running Mozambique's response to the AIDS crisis, for example. So structural adjustment, debt, turned out to be the greatest single cause of impoverishment in the 20th century, with the important exception of China. Isabella Weber's book is a great accounting of why China is an exception, how China became an exception. And that really is the world that we're still living in during COVID, when, as Jayati said, we kind of got the roaring back to life of dollar-denominated sovereign debt burdens. Done.
Okay. Great. Well, we have some great questions that are coming in. So thank you to our audience who have started sending in questions, and I want to encourage others as well to write in. Before I start reading the questions, would either of you like to respond to any of Hannah's comments?
Just to say, fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Very concise and just wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Hannah.
Fabio, I don't know if you had, Hannah was offering a very empirical on the ground kind of analysis, but is there something philosophically that you can talk about in terms of the way in which the notion of temporality gets inscribed into conceptions of debt? There's always a kind of futurity that's you're sort of imagining when perhaps you may not be in debt anymore, but at the same time that debt is, sort of eclipsing any notion of a future proper because it's in service to your past debt. So is there a kind of, I don't know if you have any thoughts on a more philosophical register of how the concept of debt in a way fixes you in a pastness that you can't, that sort of forecloses your future.
I mean, yes, obviously with both debt and financialization, the future gets eroded more and more. So you end up with less of a future. I think this is a phenomenon that you can see in the new generations, right? They don't seem to have a future. They don't seem to be able to imagine a future because when you're in debt, or even within a financial system that stretches into the future, clearly the future collapses into this eternal present that you don't seem to be able to escape. The other issue that I kind of brought up the other day in the talk was really connected with the idea of money. Money ultimately comes from the Latin monere, which means to remind, has to do with memory, and more precisely with the Greek mnemosine. Mnemosine was the Greek goddess of memory. And I kind of quoted Don DeLillo the other day and passages from a film called Cosmopolis to just say that money has lost its social narrative. You know, that's what Don DeLillo says very, very kind of literally. Has lost its social narrative. Money is just talking to itself. And I think that's where we are. The financial moment, the end of the productive moment, as Frederick Jameson put it in the 90s and others before him. The end of the productive moment of capitalism has led us to a place where money talks to itself, is only capable of talking to itself, is not allowing us to imagine the future any longer, because the future is colonized, we could say, you know, to use a term that has been used today, by finance and by debt, obviously, these debt obligations that we are all hostage to. Well, not us, and obviously the poor countries more specifically. But yeah, the temporality itself, in philosophical term, I think, has been disrupted and has shifted. We are within a different kind of temporality today.
I want to turn to the questions. Kate Kuhns, Executive Director of Global Studies, has a great question. When we talk about struggles against debt today, what's really at stake? On the one level, these social movements challenge the concentration of financial power and its control over both economies and governments. On another, they resist the everyday forms of impoverishment and dependence created by rising personal and public debt. How do you see these two dimensions, the fight against financial domination and the fight against debt-driven poverty, coming together in the politics of debt today?
I'm going to suggest that Hannah answers that one.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I'm happy to start with that. It's very related, actually, to a question that Jisha was going to ask me later, so I may channel some of that. But in some ways, I have a one-word answer, and my answer is they come together through the figure of the debtor. And the figure of the debtor at the household level, at the municipal level, and at the sovereign level being politicized and collectivized in new ways. I completely agree with what Fabio said in his kind of opening, that we have underestimated the centrality of debt and credit to contemporary racial capitalism. Part of that is because all of us have been so profoundly influenced in certain ways by Marxist lineages that understand the worker. But all, so often we'll say, oh, well, in the era of neoliberalism, or like in the 1980s with financialization and Reagan and Thatcher. But on the contrary, if you look back to how the United States was colonized, how, in fact, indigenous people were kicked off their land. Certainly some of it was outright violence, but a lot of it was the use of the mortgage. Here I'm thinking about Kay-Sue Park's excellent scholarship on the use of the mortgage to dispossess indigenous people of their land, right? And in fact, the mortgage, what one of a famous Federal Reserve guy in like the 1930s, I'm going to forget his name, called the wheel within the wheel of American capitalism. The 1930s was before neoliberalism, right? So I think that it is actually a historical misunderstanding. This is not to displace the importance of the worker. On the contrary, workers organized collectively to challenge capital must be met by debtors organized collectively in union formations to challenge capital, must be also met, this is my wall-to-wall power version, by tenants organized collectively to challenge capital, and even, to be a complete class traitor, mortgage holders. I think mortgage holders should have a union, and I can talk to you about that in a moment. So I'm actually, one of the books that I've read somewhat recently that's really influenced my thinking on this and influenced a book that I'm writing on this wall-to-wall organizing, that to me, I'm going to use this. To me, this is the answer to who will move the dead body of capitalism out of the way. We need to stop thinking narrowly that it is only workers that have systemic material leverage over the economy when they organize, right? In fact, maybe I'll give an answer that I was going to give before. So I'm just going to read you a counterfactual that I've written before, and maybe some of you have seen it. So let's look at 2008, the 2008 financial crisis, through a flipped lens, right? Predatory mortgage debt reimagined as collective leverage, because I'm going to use this to illustrate the potential power and scale of debtor organizing. Okay, so to be very simple, to just remind folks, it was unintentionally coordinated mortgage non-payments, right? Because of predatory loans, we can talk about all that, that destabilized the entire global financial system, not just the United States, the entire global financial system. This is also partially because the US dollar is so central to the entire global financial system, right? But what if that non-payment had been intentional and coordinated? What if there had been a mortgage holders union in which union organizers began to hear from their members that they could no longer afford to make their payments? What would the union do? They would decide to threaten collective non-payment to do what? To negotiate a bailout for homeowners rather than banks, right? That counterfactual sounds very far-fetched, but having researched it, it was Sheila Bair, who was the Republican head of the FDIC during that crisis, who was arguing that homeowners should be bailed out, not banks, she said. And it was the Democratic Treasury secretaries, Henry Paulson, Timothy Geithner, they dismissed Sheila Bair. They said that the banks have to be bailed out at the expense of homeowners. Why? Because as Fabio said, banks are now the ones that supply the social safety net, right? So you are bailing out the social, this is at least what the government thinks, by bailing out the banks, right? So we can say that some debtors got bailed out, banks, security investors got bailed out, while others, mortgage holders, were not, right? This was a massive foreclosure crisis. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was not experienced equally. Black mortgage owners and Latinx mortgage owners lost an extraordinary amount of wealth. It is the largest single asset stripping event since arguably the transatlantic slave trade amongst collective Black wealth, right? But had there been a nationwide union of mortgage holders, they could have been a force to negotiate Obama's HAMP, right? The Home Affordable Modification Program. It was a government-initiated program that said, oh, hey, banks, you do the mortgage relief. And guess what? 70% of the 5.7 million people who applied were denied, right? They needed a union. They needed collective representation to have a seat at that negotiating table. Of course, after the crisis, you get like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for example, but it is fundamentally based around a fiction. And that fiction is that we each hold credit contracts individually, just like it is a fiction that we are each a worker individually, and labor unions have helpfully corrected for that fiction in law. In fact, it is our contract must and should be negotiated collectively. So too, I would argue, for credit and debt contracts, and then finally we can talk about the relationship between tenants unions and mortgage holders unions if you want. But that is how I would answer that question.
That's great. Anyone else want to chime in, or I can move to it? Go ahead. Jayati, did you want to add something?
Well, just very quickly, I want to add a kind of global dimension. I think what Hannah said is absolutely right. And this ties in with another question which is in there about alternative streams of thinking in economics. And let's just quick footnote on that second question. You know, economics, it's my discipline, but unfortunately, it has always been in the service of power. Yeah, and much of mainstream economics is actually oriented towards suppressing dissident views and denying, shall we say, any plausibility or seriousness to those who actually question many of the basic assumptions and axioms that are highly problematic. So there's a problem in mainstream economics, but increasingly we are finding interdisciplinary thinkings that recognize alternative views. Now, within economics, Hannah has just reminded me that, yes, my own department here at UMass Amherst, with very few others, is one of the places where still heterodox thinking, where non-mainstream alternative thinking is being developed and encouraged. And we also have some really brilliant and exciting research scholars here who are, I think, the hope for the future, for sure. And they come from all over the world, which is still, they come from all over the world, which I think is very encouraging. But also there are interdisciplinary movements, which I think increasingly within academics also it's recognized that sticking to your own narrow little silo of an approach is all wrong and gets us nowhere. And so there are ways of thinking about how to change things and what we do about them, which are based on a much more transdisciplinary way where people come together to think about the problem as one whole from whatever expertise we may have. And a particular example I'd like to mention is the Club of Rome set up a Transformational Economics Commission, and we produced a book which is called Earth for All. And it was very interesting because it was published 50 years after the Club of Rome's original book, Limits to Growth, which, by the way, turns out to have been terrifyingly prescient. I mean, actually, everyone dismissed it at the time, saying, oh, it's very alarmist. Unfortunately, every prediction it made in there has come true. But anyway, 50 years later, this is a group of climate scientists, physicists, systems theorists, modelers, philosophers, political scientists, economists, anthropologists, who got together to actually envisage a more well, bearable future, actually, one in which humanity and the planet survive and flourish. And I think Earth for All is actually a really interesting book. I'm very proud to be associated with it because it's not just an analysis, it's a call for action. And it's so easy to be depressed and defeated and say, oh my God, what can we possibly do? But this is looking at not just the global changes that are required, but within countries, within your localities, municipalities. There are many different levels at which we can demand change, but they have to be specific. It's not just enough to have a Fridays for the Future saying, change everything. We need to have very specific demands for specific changes. And so some of them are outlined there. And as I say, it's a movement. So, I would recommend everybody, if I can put it down here, there is a website, but there's also, oh gosh, where is it? It's called Earth for All, but there's a way to access a lot of it. And I would really encourage anyone who's interested to be part of that, because it can be a link of local with broader global movements. On how to think about the economy, just very quickly, I want to emphasize that we've been going about it completely the wrong way. We've always been thinking of various other social desirables as in terms of how they can contribute to GDP. So, anything, you say, oh, we have to get more women into work because that will increase GDP by so much. Or it's important to increase the health of the people because they become more productive workers and that increases GDP by so much. That's nonsense. We have to think of the kind of society we want, the relationship with nature that we want, how we preserve our planet, and say, okay, what is the economy that will get us there? It is possible to be an economist and think of it that way. But it really means that most economists have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again in terms of thinking about how to organize and manage the economy. And that's really what we should be demanding of all of us, and especially people in my own discipline, that stop saying how X and Y will help the economy. Talk about what are your goals as humanity, as a survivor of one of the species on the planet and so on, and say, what's the economy that's going to get us there? Why are we not getting there? What do we have to do to get to that? And it's not just only huge, massive transformational change. It can be small things that are thin end of the wedge that push in that direction.
That's terrific. We only have a couple of minutes. It's kind of shocking to me how quickly this conversation has gone. But maybe in closing, I'd just love to hear you say a little bit about what gives you hope today in terms of thinking about the future. Hannah?
I will preface what I'm about to say by saying that I am infamous among those who know me for being an optimist. And I didn't say like, I'm popular for being, I'm infamous for being an optimist. So take this as you will. But I would say that social movements give me hope. That is in part because I'm deeply involved in them and I spend most of my life participating in them. But I'll give you some that I think nicely answer this question loosely about how to think about the interlocking debt crises, both at household, municipal, and sovereign levels, but also in the global south. So in the global north and global south. So sovereign debt, austerity, right, is often one of the outcomes of sovereign debt. This is how Jayati started us off. School fees, suddenly where school was free before, you have to pay for school fees because it's been privatized. There's a toll on the road that you drive down. You have to pay to access medicines that maybe had a social safety net before. Often you go into debt for them. Microfinance is provided for you often in the global south, a credit card here in the global north, or you go to the dentist and you can't pay and they pass you a little prepaid card that says GE, General Electric on it, because they've somehow also gotten into the credit card business. You go to Target to buy your commodities and they ask you at the same time, do you want to apply for a credit card, right? We see these things interlinking. But austerity in the global south is often how this manifests. And countries from South Africa to Argentina, which has been in the news recently about this, frantically are trying to pay off dollar-denominated debts. And to do that, what they often turn to is extraction, right? Trying to sell those minerals, trying to sell hydrocarbons on dollar-denominated markets. So when I think of, we have a paper coming out on this that's based on a bunch of interviews with Global South social movements that are working at the intersection of climate and debt. So the South Africa Green Revolutionary Council is doing these community-to-community education projects on how to refuse extractive projects, right? Come to my town, this is what they promised us. Do you see environmental destruction? Say no to them. And they have succeeded in stopping extraction, right? They have succeeded in saying no to Shell and saying no to Chevron. Or I was talking about Ni Una Menos, which is a collective that is based in many South American countries, Argentina, Chile. So Ni Una Menos is a feminist collective that talks about how household debt, as I said earlier, is an implosion of sovereign debt into the household and is disproportionately borne by women. Needless to say, this is not only true in South America, this is true across the planet, global north and global south. So they use the feminist strike, right, to draw attention to how it is that women have to negotiate often these debts of social reproduction, sometimes at the penalty of domestic violence. And then I'll point to two in the global north and then I'm done. Don't Pay UK in 2022, right? A whole bunch of normal people, Britain's, what is it called? The Office of Gas and Electricity Markets said in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, we're gonna raise national rates on energy. Everybody was super angry. They started a campaign, ratepayers, right? These are debtors, people who owe utility bills. They said, sign up and commit that if they raise the rates, you won't pay. And the way that they made this online threat real is to say, show them you're serious by getting yourself off of automatic payments, right? 300,000 people took themselves off of automatic payments. Why does that matter? When Moody's comes to call at the utility company, Moody's says, are your people on automatic payments? Because if so, they're going to get a better credit rating. So it freaked out the utility companies. Then there was the Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak debacle, but the rate increase never happened. And I'll just end with the debt collective very quickly. We launched the first student debtors union in 2014, with folks who incurred debts when they went to Corinthian colleges, which was the largest for-profit college chain in the country. 7 years later, we won $5.8 billion in debt abolition for all 560,000 people who owed debt to Corinthian colleges. And that is now only a small part of what we've managed to organize and abolish with our debtors unions, about $180 billion to date, student debt, medical debt, carceral debt, abortion debt, and lunch debt. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So this debtors union thing that I'm talking about, it's not merely speculative. We've been at it for the last 10 years, learned a lot, but we've started.
We are out of time, so unfortunately we won't be able to hear from our other panelists. So thank you so much again. This has been an incredible conversation and we're excited to upload this onto our website so others who weren't able to join us today can hear it. Thank you so much again.